A disaster of such epic proportions is not merely the affair of individuals or corporations. It is inevitably a political issue, even an international one. If only for the sake of appearances, political entities on both sides of the Atlantic were obliged to investigate. In the United States, the instigator was Senator William Alden Smith, who was among the first to meet Carpathia when she brought the survivors to New York. Smith was known as a monopoly buster, and his motive in setting up a Senate inquiry was to prove that Titanic's owner, the White Star Line, was at fault in the disaster. If he could prove this, then survivors and victims' families would have legal grounds to file for damages. But the person Smith was really after was the American banking magnate J.P. Morgan, who controlled White Star. The investigation began at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York on April 19th. 3 days later, it moved to Washington, D.C. Unlike the British inquiry to follow, the U.S. inquiry called both crew and passengers to testify. Many of the personal stories we know today were unearthed by the Senate investigation. J. Bruce Ismay, as the managing director of White Star and a surviving passenger, was among the first to be interrogated by Senator Smith. Following the collision, Ismay's behavior had by all accounts been bizarre. On Carpathia, he had withdrawn into an impenetrable silence. During the Senate inquiry, Ismay appeared still to be overwhelmed and spoke very softly, almost whispering. He refused to admit any responsibility in the disaster. When asked whether he had urged Captain Smith to rush Titanic to New York despite ice warnings, Ismay replied that he had no say in the day-to-day operations of his ships. The lookout who had spotted the iceberg, Frederick Fleet, testified rather disturbingly that he was, in his own words, not a good judge of distance. Since Fleet could not describe how big the iceberg looked when first sighted, he had this picture drawn. The highest-ranking surviving officer, Charles Lightoller, was questioned by the Senate inquiry about the competence of the deceased Captain Smith and the general handling of the ship. Lightoller offered nothing but praise for Smith and his fellow officers. The Senate inquiry's final report was submitted on May 28, 1912. It called for 3 pieces of legislation. First, a Medal of Honor to be given the rescue ship's Captain Rostron. Second, an investigation into maritime laws and regulations. Third, an investigation into regulations governing ship construction and equipment. This second investigation would lead to laws requiring ships to carry lifeboats for everyone aboard, conduct lifeboat drills, and remain in wireless contact with other ships around the clock. Senator Smith's investigation was not able to prove any kind of criminal negligence on the part of the White Star Line or Captain Smith. The most he could do was to criticize the behavior of Captain Smith and White Star. On the other side of the Atlantic, a British inquiry began while the American investigation was still underway. The British Board of Trade conducted the inquiry. This was the arm of government which had permitted Titanic and other ships to sail without enough lifeboats in the first place. The Board of Trade was, in effect, asked to investigate itself, and the only likely result was a whitewashing of the facts. The inquiry began on May 2, 1912, and lasted 36 days. Each of the 94 witnesses were interviewed prior to the inquiry and essentially answered yes or no to their own statements, which were then read back to them. Witnesses were not allowed to elaborate at length, as they were at the American inquiry. The British inquiry was also far more technical, focusing on the operations of the ship itself and not the survivors' stories. 2 exceptions to this rule were first-class survivors Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon. They were accused of paying the crew in their lifeboat not to return to pick up survivors, even though there was room for 28 additional passengers in their lifeboat. Sir Cosmo took the stand and explained that the check was meant as a philanthropic gesture so that the sailors could replace their lost possessions. It had nothing to do with the fact that their lifeboat did not return. On the stand, Lady Duff Gordon used the term hazy to describe her recollection of what she did or did not say that night. The Duff Gordons thus had their day in court, but failed to clear their names. Perhaps the only major discovery resulting from the British inquiry involved testimony from Alexander Carlyle, who was one of Titanic's designers. Carlyle testified that the original design for Titanic would have provided for more than the 20 lifeboats she ended up with. When the managing director of White Star, J. Bruce Ismay, was asked about these initial designs, he said he had no knowledge of them. However, the original plans Carlyle mentioned have since been found, and they clearly show that Titanic was supposed to have more boats. Ismay's signature appears on this document. Rather than find fault with the regulations they had established, the British Board of Trade came to the astonishing conclusion that even if there had been more lifeboats on Titanic, no more lives would have been saved. Continuing its defense of the status quo, the board also exonerated Ismay, Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, and even the late Captain Smith. The other findings of the British inquiry, however, were largely the same as those of the United States Senate investigation. In the future, ships would have to carry more lifeboats, and the shipping industry would be more strictly regulated.